Hello and welcome back to Miles to Go. I'm Miles O'Brien, and I am back a little sooner than I was before, so I'm going to try to hold to that promise. Let's talk today about methane, or what is euphemistically known as natural gas. I met a very interesting advocate who is focused on the subject of methane, and specifically how much leaks into the atmosphere. It's a huge greenhouse gas problem. We met deep in the heart of the Allegheny National Forest of northwestern Pennsylvania. The researcher is Melissa Ostroff, and she's blazing trails down narrow roads through thick brush, hoping to see the methane for the trees. She's with an environmental advocacy group called Earthworks. She operates a $100,000 thermal imaging camera. It can record plumes of hydrocarbons. She's hunting for methane, of course, natural gas. It's often found along with oil, and it's often found leaking out of oil wells, active or not. The forests of Pennsylvania are filled with thousands of orphaned and abandoned oil wells, many of them more than a century old. History's first oil rush began not far from here in 1859 when Edwin Drake drilled the first commercially viable well. Pennsylvania now estimates there are more than 350,000 orphaned and abandoned wells in the state.
This is where oil exploration, commercialized versions began, right? This is a historic turf if you're in the oil business.
That's right. It's part of the history of this region. It's part of the culture. The first commercial oil well was drilled not far from here. So there's a long history of oil and gas extraction in this region. Long before fracking started in other portions of the state, oil and gas was the business to be in here, and it dramatically changed the landscape. There are some great pictures from 100, 200 years ago showing what some of these towns look like when they started to drill. And as a result, there are about 750,000 of these orphan and abandoned wells that are scattered across the state. And we don't know where them are. Many of them are actually very close together, but they're tucked away into land that has now been reforested, just like this area. And then, in the midst of that, we've got active oil and gas wells that are still turning a profit very slowly, but they're nearing the end of their lifespan. And that's where we have concerns about what does the future look like, and what does the past tell us about what the future looks like for this industry.
And connect the dots between this road and your neighborhood in Philadelphia. Why are you interested in both?
They look completely different, and that's the interesting part. You're out here, you're in the middle of a forest on these dirt roads. What could that have to do with the Philadelphia street that I live on that's row homes and hardly any trees and densely populated? But actually, they are impacted by the same industry and in very similar ways. Over here, we've got the beginnings and the present day of the oil and gas industry. And so in densely populated areas, we've got pipelines underground that are, underneath of the streets and feeding into each of our homes.
After our adventure in the Allegheny National Forest, I took Melissa up on her invitation and went to her home in Philadelphia to talk to her about her work and the surprising, frightening evidence she's found in her neighborhood and even in her basement.
Did you come to this role in life?
My background is in public health. I have a master's in public health and a general background in public policy. I worked in the state Senate in Pennsylvania in the past and have always had public service orientation towards my work, but eventually moved into the environmental health space, which moved me then into the oil and gas space around environmental health and climate.
Oil and gas, environment, and climate. When did that kind of capture your attention?
It really was when I applied to Earthworks. I hadn't previously done work in oil and gas, which is part of why I come to this with the background of someone who is more like anybody, like when I first started this work. When it comes to oil and gas specifically, I was interested in lead poisoning around environmental health in the past and built environment changes around gun violence. So I have broad environmental health background. And it was only in learning about earthworks and this position that I thought oil and gas is something I'm interested in exploring.
Sadly, there's plenty of places that you could focus on in that realm. How much, I'm just curious, before you got into the world of oil, how much did you fully appreciate the ongoing issues?
I didn't really. I knew about fracking. I knew that was happening in a different part of the state. I knew there were concerns about water contamination. I didn't know as much about the air pollution aspect of it, but my sense of the scale of the problem or how at times ill-equipped we are as a society to deal with it, I didn't know.
What then is your job description?
Part of it is becoming a certified thermographer. And Earthworks provides that training. You sign up for this course to learn about thermography, which is specifically optical gas imaging thermography. So how do you use this special type of infrared camera to see oil and gas pollution? But you're not just filming the pollution with an intent to see it and then do nothing about it. The goal is to do advocacy with that footage that you capture.
So the idea is to take the camera out to places where there might be leaks of some kind or and then report. That sounds simple, but it's actually way more complicated.
Because you're not only reporting it to the Department of Environmental Protection, but you're advocating for policy change. And that's where my role has moved into this field and policy advocate, because so much of what I do is designed to actually change things at more of a systemic level, rather than just filing complaints and hoping that alone will change things.
So you get the job, you secure the camera, you get trained, and of course the first thing you want to do is point it out the door, right?
Right. There have been a situation happening outside my apartment, actually starting prior to when I started my job at Earthworks. Maybe it started a month before, where there was jackhammering happening in the middle of the night, waking me up, waking neighbors up. And nobody knew what was going on. And eventually, I saw folks working out there during the day and saw that they were from PGW, which is the Philadelphia Gas Works. Here in Philadelphia, it's our gas utility. It's publicly owned. And I asked them what was happening and found out there had been a gas leak. And that had been happening, but I didn't really connect the dots for a couple of months. I was preparing to go out to the Allegheny National Forest. It was my first trip out there. And I've got the equipment lined up, and I see that PGW is outside again, that this gas leak situation is somehow continuing. And I don't know why. I don't know if it's a new gas leak, if it's the same one. There's been no information that was provided to myself or other residents about the ongoing situation there. And it just dawned on me all of a sudden, I can use this camera outside here in Philadelphia, and it captures methane. That's what it sees. And methane is the same thing that's coming out of the ground potentially here in Philadelphia as what we see in the Allegheny National Forest and these other places that we go. So,
mission was to go to the Allegheny National Forest, and it was on your doorstep, quite literally.
Exactly.
Well, what's through your mind at that point? Was it your sense in advance of that methane was as ubiquitous a problem as it was, or is that like a real eye-opener for you?
It was an eye-opener. I had no idea. I hadn't really put those two pieces together, that the methane that we see with this camera at well sites, at compressor stations, that's part of the production and transmission and processing side of this industry, is also on the distribution side, that we're actually able to use this camera to see methane here in Philadelphia and other places. I didn't realize how ubiquitous of a problem it was.
At that point, did you just start walking around the neighborhoods with the camera and looking for possible leaks? Seems like that would be the first thing I'd do.
In my own neighborhood in Philadelphia, like in Queen Village where I was living previously, I regularly smelled the scent of mercaptan, which is that odorant that they add to gas as it's distributed. And I started to make note of locations where I was smelling that mercaptan odor and would go back and take a look. And there were a few spots just within a few blocks of where I was living at the time where I would find gas leaks happening regularly. I ended up having to save the PGW gas leak hotline in my phone as like a speed dial, because I was just calling them so frequently with gas leaks. But on my own block in particular, I was right across the street from an elementary school. And that was the worst one that I saw in that area. I certainly didn't do a full scan of the city. I really was just doing what was in front of me at the time. But I kept seeing it come back on that block there. And sometimes a really enormous plume coming out of like a manhole cover connected to a Verizon line where the gas never should have been entering. But I then talked to neighbors, someone out walking their dog, and they'd tell me, oh, I smell the gas leak down there. And I would see that the plume would actually travel. Maybe they would fix the leak over here, but it would move down the block and find a different exit. And what I've learned through this work is that methane is a gas that wants to escape. It doesn't want to be kept in. And so if there is an opportunity for it to escape, whether that's from a wellhead or from a pipeline or whether it's even in somebody's home, it's going to find a way out.
So you really have video proof that it's everywhere.
Exactly. Yeah. And that it's been an eye-opener for me. It's been something that's put the work that I do in Western Pennsylvania and Northeastern Pennsylvania, where fracking is happening, where we see these older and orphan wells, into a context that wherever the oil and gas industry is present, even if it's not at the wellhead, there are methane leaks. But there were a couple of times where I call them and they'd take a look and they'd give me a call and say, hey, we didn't find anything. And I would actually go down with my camera and point out the spot. And then they'd put their gas meter there and it would turn from green to yellow to red. Oh, actually, whoa, we found it. Now we got to shut down the whole street. I need access to your basement. It's changed the situation from one in which they were ready to drive away and call it clear, all clear, everything's fine, to one in which suddenly it's a safety situation. And it was scary that it was my equipment that was the difference from one to the other.
That's a pretty strong argument for the utilities being equipped with these devices, and they're not required to do together.
They're not. I spoke with some of the workers who were like, can I take a look at your camera? And I wish we had access to this thing. For whatever reason, it's not something the utility has invested in.
Now, you actually found it in your basement here in a new place, too. You moved.
I did.
Wait for the methane. No, not so much. Tell me what happened.
It's interesting. There are parallels there. We see people that move in fracking country, try to get away from the frack pads, and a new one shows up next to them. In this case, I moved for a variety of reasons, but it was very ironic that I moved to a different neighborhood in the city. And within 6 months of me moving here, through my sister actually coming over and smelling gas in my apartment or in my house, which I did not smell, that led me to take a look at my gas meter that's located in my basement. And lo and behold, there was a leak coming from the gas meter. Looking through that camera, it looked so similar to the leaks that I see at well sites in very different parts of the state.
It kind of reminds me of one of those horror films. A good example is When a Stranger Calls from 1979. A young babysitter watching over children in a large, eerie house at night. She receives a series of increasingly disturbing phone calls from an anonymous man. He's asking her, have you checked the children? As the tension mounts, she contacts the police, who eventually trace the calls. The terrifying revelation, the calls are coming from inside the house. Get out, get out, get out. The methane monster was in Melissa's house, in her basement. Methane traps about 80 times more heat during a 20-year lifetime than carbon dioxide. It is responsible for 30% of human-caused global warming. So next time somebody tries to tell you methane or natural gas is a clean fossil fuel, I promise you they're not accounting for all those leaks. It is by no means clean. And hopefully the good work of Melissa Ostroff and others will help raise awareness about this. That's it for Miles to Go. I'm Miles O'Brien. I promise I'll be back soon. I'm going to keep trying as long as you tell me you want to keep hearing what I'm talking about. I ask you a favor. Just tell somebody to check this podcast out. Maybe we can build a little momentum. We'll see you next time.